Hello everyone, my name is Mark. Welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons. Today we are talking about World of Warcraft. So, this is a Dungeons and Dragons channel. We're not switching topics exactly today, but I want to take some ideas from one and pull it into the other. So it's been a number of years since I played World of Warcraft. It is still going strong. I don't really know. I don't keep up with the lore in the most recent expansions, but I played for many, many years and made a lot of real life friends through the game who I still keep in touch with. So I have very fond memories from it. But I also took it very, very seriously for a long time and would be on. I spent way more time on it than I do with D&D, actually. I would be on 3 or 4 nights a week doing different quest chains and raiding, and some of it was fun, some of it was a little bit of a grind, and while I don't miss some of it, I do have very fond memories from it. And I think that World of Warcraft had a lot of interesting ideas in it, not just for MMOs, but for RPGs as a whole. And I want to talk about a few of them that I think might be able to make the adaptation into Dungeons and Dragons. So there are different ways that you can experience WoW. One of them is the solo experience, which is, you can just be off on your own doing quest chains, talking to NPCs, adventuring and seeing the world, that sort of thing. You can do PvP, or player versus player, which is usually in some sort of arena or structured combat where you're fighting against other players in the game. And then there are the smaller dungeons where you form up with a party, sort of like a traditional D&D party, and you've got your tanks and your healers and your damage dealers and other roles and things like that. And sometimes you can have hybrid roles, and there's usually 5 of you, and you go into a dungeon and you do the thing, and there are a number of boss fights, and it resembles D&D in certain ways. And then you have your largest dungeons, the raids, where usually you're with even larger groups. Now, I don't know what the raid group size is currently in WoW. When I played, it was either 10 person or 25 person. So you needed to get together with 9 other people or 24 other people. And these were interesting logistically, to say the least, but they could be a lot of fun if you had a good group and a fun group to run with consistently. So it was here in these raids that I spent a lot of my time in the game, and it was here that I really enjoyed portions of the game because the boss fights were very unique, they were very interesting, and usually there were some elements across boss fights where you could say, okay, this is a certain aspect of boss fights that shows up in a lot of different fights. And so you started to understand some of the mechanics of the game and how to approach it. Other times, the mechanics in the boss fights were very, very unique. They were unique to one specific enemy or fight. And I always liked the creativity of these, and the more interesting ones were, to me, some of the most fun I ever had with the game. And it got me thinking when I started to DM D&D, when I started to run the game and create boss encounters and was trying to create interesting fight encounters, I started to think, well, how do I change this up a little bit? And at a certain point, my mind drifted back to my days playing WoW, and I asked myself, what of these mechanics or ideas or challenges from some of these boss fights might you be able to port into D&D? What would that look like? So that's what this video is about. And the biggest hurdle with some of these that I see in D&D isn't making them work mechanically. There are a lot of mechanics in D&D that you can adapt into certain ideas. The problem is that in MMOs, like WoW and like many others, you have a lot of chances to kill the boss. If you fail, you all die, but then you just resurrect, you wait, you heal up, you do whatever you need to do, you repair your equipment, but within 15 minutes, you're back in front of the boss ready to fight again. And so a lot of it was learning the mechanics through trial and error. In D&D, we don't necessarily have that luxury, because if you're doing this through trial and error with something brand new and you don't figure it out on the first try, there might not be a second try. So the biggest hurdle to me isn't in how you take some of these mechanics from one system to another to make interesting boss fights, because that is the end goal of this, but it's in figuring out how to get that information across to your players to say, okay, here is a unique element of this fight and here's what it is, so that they can plan in advance and really be prepared on the first try. So this is a little bit of a tightrope to walk as a DM, because you don't want to spell out the abilities that a boss has. You don't want to spell out the spells that they have or the abilities or what layer actions they might have. So a lot of things that happen in WoW fights I think could be ported into layer actions and they would make a lot of sense. But if players don't know to expect them, that might be a problem. But if they do know to expect them, it might ruin the sense of surprise. So there's a little bit of a tightrope walk in that. And how I would try to get around this is I would probably have, and you can do this with other things too, there are ways that you have as a DM to say to your players, this fight is probably going to be a lot harder than you're expecting. You might even need to run away from it. You can sort of prep them without saying that to them directly. You do it narratively through things like context clues or NPCs who will tell them certain things about the fight. So maybe a particular, big bad guy that they're trying to take down has some particular ability. All right, so why are they trying to take this bad guy down? Probably somebody else that they've talked to, an NPC, a quest giver, has either fought against them or heard about others fighting against them. Maybe the quest giver lost a relative to this boss, this big bad that the players are trying to take down. Whatever it might be, what you can have is for that NPC to say, we went in, we were trying to take down this person, and here's what happened, and here's why we died, and here's why I need you to go in, but I'm going to give you this knowledge to help you so that you don't make the same mistakes that we did. So I think that's an easy way to do it. You can do it narratively through an NPC who maybe was in a similar party or, was brother or sister or mother or father to somebody who died at the axe of the boss or of the dragon who swallowed them whole or whatever it is. But have that information passed to the party through the NPC rather than through you, the DM. Another way you could do this, it's a little bit of a trope, but you could do something like, well, legend has it that such and such a guardian does blah, 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 blah. And whatever that is the specific ability. You don't have to spell it out exactly in mechanical terms, but if legend has it that they do this particular thing that's killed hundreds of people, the players know to be ready for that particular thing and can probably plan for it in advance. So once you've determined how you want your party to figure out about this unique mechanic, then how do you get it into the game? And this is where you're probably going to have to homebrew a little bit, but I think a lot of these can be baked into the mechanics pretty easily. So one example, and I'm going to give a few examples here, although there are probably dozens more that I'm not mentioning that I could, that include unique mechanics from games that you've played. It doesn't have to be World of Warcraft, that's where my experience is, but you can pull in things like this from other games that you've played, and I think it can work. So one example I'm going to give you is an enrage timer. So a lot of boss fights in WoW have what's known as an enrage timer. And what that means is essentially if you take a certain amount of time and you haven't killed the boss by that point, they enrage, which is a particular buff that they get where they start doing a lot more damage. And at that point, if it's a competitive fight, if you don't out-level the fight by many, many levels, if they enrage, they're going to be killing the entire party within mere moments. So if you make it to the enrage and they are not dead, you're probably dead. So how do you do this in D&D without telegraphing it too obviously? So one thing I think you could do is talk about, or have an NPC talk about, the strength of this particular foe and how they seem to grow in rage and in strength. You could, talk it up like the Incredible Hulk, where the angrier he gets, the stronger he gets, something like that. And then over the course of the fight, either at a certain point in the fight or over the course of the fight, they do progressively more damage, which ramps up the tension as the players realize, oh, he's going to get angrier and angrier, stronger and stronger, do more and more damage until we take this person down. I think that could be done pretty easily. And, how much damage you want to add is going to vary depending on the level of your players, how difficult you want the encounter to be. That's where some of the intricacies of combat encounter creation come into play. So we're not going to get into that in this video. We're just going to talk about, in broad strokes, how you would go about creating it. So you might add a d8 and then 2d8, 2 if they hit, rather than his base damage. And then 3d8 and 4d8 and 5d8. And the longer the fight goes, the scarier it gets and the more likely this fight is to be deadly for the players. And then when you're in the fight, you can describe that. You can talk about how they physically see this opponent getting bigger and stronger, and how their blows seem to land with more force. So even if they're missing with their attacks, you can talk about how it's chipping the stone or the wood in whatever else that they're hitting in the environment, and how they seem to be getting more powerful as the fight goes on. That's something that you can do in the description of the encounter. So there are a lot of fights in D&D where I think the longer it goes on, as long as the party is still standing, the less worried they are, because they're closer and closer to victory, and usually the hit points are going down and down and down of their opponents. And while that would be true here too, I think finding a way to escalate the tension over the course of the fight from beginning to end could be really cool. So this is something that I haven't done yet, and a lot of these ideas are ones that sort of just exist up here that I haven't done yet, but that I think I might like to, and I think it could work really well. So one of these, at least, I have done, and there have been others, not from WoW specifically, but where I've homebrewed rules that have gone into encounters that achieve the same sort of goal of, all right, we're going to make this happen so that the tension increases, the stakes increase midway through the fight or progressively through the fight. And I love mechanics like that because it adds an element of drama to the encounter. So another element that exists in a lot of WoW fights is the concept of tank swapping. So you don't necessarily have defined roles in D&D in the same way that you do in WoW, but in WoW you would have at least one, oftentimes two, sometimes more than that, tanks. And the tanks are the ones who are there holding the attention of the boss, of the big bad, or sometimes there's more than one, and that's when you might need more than one tank. And they're the ones taking the lion's share of the damage because they're best suited for that. And they're getting healed, and they're keeping the damage away from the rest of the group. But in a lot of fights, you have to swap back and forth. So say there's a big dragon, and the tank runs up, and they're fighting the dragon, and they're there in their face, and eventually they need to hop out, and another tank hops in. And this could be for a number of different reasons, but this mechanic of having to tank swap is one that exists in a lot of fights. So how do you do it in D&D? Well, for this, I would probably create some sort of debuff or effect or condition related to getting hit by the enemy or an enemy's weapon. So say they have an enchanted axe and you get hit with the axe. Maybe that puts a particular magical effect on you where now, sort of like the enraged timer, maybe you're taking more and more damage. So if you get hit again, you get another stack of this effect. So now hits are hitting you 3 or 4 times as hard as they were at the beginning. And you need to hop out, either remove it magically or simply wait a certain amount of time until it drops off of you while somebody else runs in. And since they don't have this magical effect on them, they're going to take a normal amount of damage. So again, I think it actually ports pretty well into D&D, and it would necessitate coordinating, swapping out, and you might even have things like, in D&D you have opportunity attacks, which don't necessarily exist in WoW. So there is that to consider. So you have to be thinking about these things logistically because it is a different combat system, but I think in principle it could still work very well, and it would necessitate a level of coordination between members of the group that is one step beyond what they sometimes have to do. So now we've talked about a couple common things that you see in WoW fights and how they might translate to D&D, but they're very specific to an enemy that is attacking you. What about environmental effects? Because this is a big deal too, where you run into a room and it's the big boss encounter room in an MMO, but you're not just fighting the boss, you're fighting the environment, and maybe the boss is triggering things in the environment, but you might have ice shards or rocks falling or lava or any number of different things happening, or maybe other enemies are coming out of the walls. Who knows? You have certain effects like this in D&D, but I think they're utilized far less than what you see in some games like WoW, other MMOs, other video games. So one famous example in WoW is the safety dance. And if you don't know what the safety dance is, basically it's the floor is lava, the game you played as kids, except you're doing it while you're also trying to kill the boss. And if you can manage the safety dance where you're moving around the room so that these lava flows don't hit you, you're probably going to do okay. But if you don't, the lava is going to be what kills you, not the boss itself. So in WoW, what would happen is there would be different sections of there were like pie slices of the room, and you would see the ground, which had cracks and fissures in it, would start to glow in a particular area. And at that point you had, I don't know, maybe 5 seconds, but a certain amount of time to get out of that area onto another one of the pie slices, and then there would be a lava flow that shot up doing a lot of damage. So it telegraphed it for you so that you could see it coming. Now in D&D this is a little bit trickier because it's not in real time, it is turn-based. So if you said, for example, well, the lava is going to start bubbling on initiative 20, but what if somebody rolled a 22? So maybe now on initiative 20 the lava starts bubbling to indicate to them, all right, we need to get out of this area of the environment and over to another one. But will that person who rolled a 22 for their initiative have time for that? That's what you have to decide. So in that case, if the lava went off, say the lava chute went up on initiative 0, then at the end of the round, it would hit the person who rolled a 22 for their initiative. If the amount of damage was such that it wasn't lethal, it wasn't immediately lethal, I would probably say, okay, that's acceptable, and they're going to have to figure out a way to navigate this depending on when the lava flow shows itself and where it shows itself. But I think it would also be valid to say, you know what, I feel like that's a little bit unfair. So maybe you have it happen at the beginning of the round, regardless of who rolled what for initiative. Maybe you find a different way to telegraph it and let the players know, okay, you have one full round to get out of this area. And there may be others. It might not be lava coming up from the ground. It might be a rock fall. It might be an avalanche. It might be icicles. Depends on what your environment is. And I think you can build around that in similar ways so that if you have an ice dragon, they might have a certain primordial power over the elements in that area. So they might be able to have ice spikes come out of the wall. So maybe you need to stay away from the walls. This is just me spitballing. You don't have to use these particular ideas, but this is how I would start to go about creating those style of encounters in D&D. And you might have it as a layer action, or you might have it as a legendary action. So maybe the dragon in that particular example could use one of their legendary actions to have an ice spike come out of the wall. And maybe, again, if the damage isn't so high that it's going to kill them instantly, maybe this isn't something that the players know about, and they learn about it the first time they take damage from an ice spike coming out of the wall. So at that point they know, okay, we have to sort of cluster around the center to make sure that this doesn't happen. There are so many other ideas that actually narrowing them down into examples that I wanted to give for this video was very hard. So I had a bunch that got left on the cutting room floor because I wanted to keep this video a manageable length. But you can start to see the overarching point that I'm talking about and how you can take interesting elements from other games, adapt it into D&D, and have it still make sense within D&D. So that it doesn't feel like it's breaking the system. You know, you don't have to go outside the combat system of D&D to make these things happen. You have things like legendary actions. You have things like layer actions. And if you have other things like the stacking debuffs or the enrage timers, those sort of things that I talked about, there are ways you can set them up so that they still make sense within the internal structure of D&D and the rules that have been established from the beginning. So I'll give you 2 more examples, and again, there are others that I would love. Maybe I'll do a follow-up video where I just list 6 more that I think are interesting that could make for interesting D&D boss encounters. But the one I want to say, I have in my notes written down that this was Nefarian, which was one of the dragon encounters in WoW. I might be wrong on that, but I believe at some point in that fight, it's reversed so that damage no longer actually damages the boss. They're completely immune to that, but what does damage them is healing. So if you figured out a way to convey that, Maybe this boss has been blessed by the god of reversals. I don't know, is there a god of reversals? That probably doesn't exist. You can ignore that part, but if you find a way to convey this, it could be something where you have to heal the boss until they die or until they're unconscious rather than hitting them. That could be a very interesting inversion of what you're normally used to doing, and it might necessitate very different preparation of spells, preparation of abilities, and tactics within the fight. And the other thing that I'll say in regard to WoW, you saw this a lot more in early WoW, I think, than some of the more recent stuff. And that's that boss encounters weren't just in and of themselves. You didn't just walk into the raid or dungeon or wherever it was, fight the boss, and then it was over. Sometimes you really had to build up to it. You had to prepare for it very specifically. One that I'm thinking of was Onyxia, another dragon. They loved using dragons in WoW, and a lot of the interesting mechanics in encounters came from some of these early dragon encounters. And in the earliest versions of it, you actually needed a particular item. You needed to craft a particular item in order to survive a debuff that the boss would put on you. So I forget if it was one person or the whole raid that needed it, but in either case, this could be something where, oh, this boss is unkillable unless you have this sword, which has to deal the killing blow. Or they do this particular thing that is instant death unless you protect yourself in a certain way. So there might be a side quest that you have to go on in order to get some legendary item or blessing from a god, or insert whatever interesting thing you think would make sense in your campaign in order to complete the quest, kill the boss, take them down. It might not be something that they can do immediately. So you see this in a lot of video games where, oh, you fight the boss and they're not taking any damage, and then you realize, they're immune to X, Y, and Z. The only way we're going to kill them is if we get this legendary artifact that removes their defenses, and now we can fight them one-on-one. It's a little bit of a trope again, but at the same time, I don't see it too much in D&D, so I think it could be very refreshing for players to have to do something like that. Another mechanic that you have in D&D that's already built into the system that I think is underutilized when it comes to opponents is damage threshold. And this is similar. It's not the same as like, oh, you need this artifact to remove the curse that will allow you to fight them. Not like that exactly. But damage threshold is usually applied to buildings or structures. And basically what it says is it ignores any damage that isn't over a certain threshold. So if you have a house or a ship at sea and its damage threshold is 25, if you hit it and you do 24 damage, it's going to take 0 damage. So you have to do 25 plus for it to take any damage. Now, what the correct threshold would be for a boss fight, again, is going to depend on what level your players are at, or the PCs, the characters are at. And it'll change on how difficult you want to make the encounter. But maybe you want to fight where low-level spells aren't going to cut it, that are doing 5 to 15 damage. Maybe you set a damage threshold of 20, and it's only the bigger hits and the bigger spells that are going to land to give the boss encounter a little bit more weight, a little bit more drama, and something that's slightly different from what they're used to. So we see damage thresholds most often with structures. I don't know that I've ever seen damage threshold applied to enemies, like sentient enemies, and I think that they could be applied to those fairly easily. I actually think it makes a lot of sense for some enemies, and I think it can make for an interesting mechanical twist without having to invent something new, since it already exists in D&D. So I'm going to lament all the ideas I left on the cutting room floor. And again, I might come back to this topic and we can talk more about interesting things that could be pulled into D&D from other games that I think would add some new twists to encounters to shake things up a little bit and give you some more tools in your DMing toolbox to make interesting, fun, dramatic encounters. But I hope this gave you a handful of ideas and that one or two of them might work really well for your group. So I hope your boss fights are interesting and epic and wonderful, and I hope you got some good ideas here. And until the next one, take care.